Chapter 5, the business environment. So in this chapter we've got a lot to get through really, so I'm going to try and get through it, and I'll take my time in there. So this is going to be quite a long sort of video really. In the business environment area, we do have a lot. We've got microeconomics going on, which is supply and demand curve for goods and types of goods, and what happens to the price and the supply in particular scenarios. We've got taxation policy and the features of efficient taxation policy. We've got globalization, and we've got risk analysis, and we've got sort of scores and marks all over the place in this one really for what is a 10-mark question. So we're going to find a way around this really. So the key points within this chapter are: the external business environment is very wide ranging and requires an element of common sense to answer logically, working through the consequences of the scenarios described really. I don't think then as a consequence you can really understand this, or you can really sort of learn this chapter as a list of facts. I think you'll take far too much time, it's going to be very boring, unlikely to work, and instead you're going to have to understand it. So that's the approach that I'm going to take. I'm going to bring this subject to life, and that's what the examiner's notes are requiring really in this bit, is that the tutor should be bringing this area to life. As a consequence, you'll remember it and be able to apply what's required. Don't think you're going to really get very far in this bit because it's too wide-ranging to be able to sort of just memorize a load of, if something happens, the price of a given good goes up and down. Just nonsense, it's not going to work. If the business understands how demand from its customers change in relation to prices, which is the demand curve, that's what the demand curve is. So if business can understand the demand curve, or how it costs change in relation to the amount produced, so it's a supply curve, so it can understand its demand, understands its cost, it can set prices in production to maximize its profit. That's the whole point of microeconomics. There's various different types of goods whose prices are going to change in different ways in given scenarios. So that's what we're going to try to understand that and see what happens from that point of view. That's the microeconomics element of it. Macroeconomics, we've got our fiscal policy, typically used to stimulate or reduce demand, as well as to pay for government spending. That's fiscal policy. Taxes and government spending. Also as well, we might have taxation policy, investment policy, those kind of things. And then we've got monetary policy, which is about inflation, controlling the money supply and interest rates to reduce inflation or to influence inflation. Make sure it doesn't go into deflation, but don't make sure it doesn't go too high either. And exchange rates. At level 3, you'll start to discuss something called stagflation, which we might have had in the UK for the last sort of year or so, really, where both the economy is contracting but inflation is going through the roof, and that's sort of a weird situation in economics that can happen. Taxation policy should follow 6 general principles. You've got to memorize those. Doesn't in practice, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through it how it doesn't in practice, almost to help you memorize them. Be a little bit political that bit, because you can sort of say, well, one chancellor doing one thing, one chancellor doing another thing that perhaps doesn't follow the general principles of good taxation. They would argue differently in terms of fair taxation and what have you. And then globalization there'll be a question on that as well, in terms of what's the impact of globalization, what's the risks, and it'll be something along the lines of a question of saying globalization affects every department in the business, not just the sales department or whatever. And then risk, we'll have a sort of simple bit about risk, which is the potential for loss and reduction in the value of investment. And we're going to use pestle analysis, so political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental analysis to categorize risks. Basically, we use that to get going actually in terms of highlighting risks in real life. But in the question, you might get categorize the risks in terms of which ones are political, which ones are social, which ones are legal, that kind of thing. So let's get going then. First of all, demand curves. Right, so in terms of demand, imagine that you run a business, and one of the key challenges you face is how much you should charge your customers. If it's too low, you're going to miss out on the profits that you might have got if you charged a higher price. If it's too high, people might not buy your product, and they might go to a different supplier. You may produce something, something that has a weird demand curve, which, let's say you produce women's handbags, and if you offer them too cheaply, they're not considered like prestigious enough, and so demand actually falls. So women's expensive handbags used for gifts, let's say on the birth of a child or whatever, typically what's known as gift-in goods. So you've got these sort of things that might happen, and businesses do spend considerable amounts of time trying to work out what prices they should charge. What the demand curve for a good shows, and what the demand curve really sort of shows the amount of goods demanded at each price. Now, what I would say as well is that in the next chapter, when we do profit motive and corporate social responsibility, this assumes, supply and demand curves assumes that the key thing for suppliers is that the maximization of profit. It might be a question, this book that you've got associated with all these videos could be charged a much higher price. I think it's like sort of £20 plus. Typically, it's the price of the book. I charge it a heck of a lot lower price than that, simply because I want to charge a lower price. And, so you different objectives in real life. In there, something like say maximization of turnover or something, but in this one, we're going to assume under our supply and demand curves that the point of supply and demand curves is to maximize profits, and that's how our prices and quantity supply are going to move. So we've got the easiest way to look at our demand curve is we've got our demand curve here, and I'll go back to sort of A-level economics really, and we usually sort of set out a nice 10-10 demand curve, where what happens is that as we reduce the price by £1, another unit is sold. So we reduce the price from 9 to 8, we sell another one, so we go from 2 to 3, and we get this nice sort of 10-10 curve here. This is the marginal revenue line. I'm not sure whether you really need it at this stage. You probably need it at level 3, but that's actually how the additional income that we're getting for every sort of reduction in price that we get really. And as we can see, as we get to we sold 5 of them at a price of £5 each. If we reduced our price to £4, then we would get another unit sold, but we would have had to have reduced our price by £1 to all the previous 5. So actually our amount of turnover is going to go down. So we sort of have this reduction now in our marginal revenue as we're going through. So we've got a demand curve here. What we're going to consider in the exam? Well, we can increase shifts in demand. So increases in demand. So an increase in demand is a shift in the demand curve to the right. So at the same price, so let's say here £10. Previously we had non-demanded, and now we've got 2 demanded. 8 price we had 2 demanded, and now we're going to have 4 demanded. So we've got this shift in the right in our demand curve when our demand increases. So let's say there's a fashion change, our things in demand, or some celebrities endorsed our product or something, shifts to the right. Alternatively, reduction in our demand shifts to the left. Reduction to the left. So increased demand shifts to the right, reduction in demand moves to the left. And you're going to have to understand how to draw these demand curves. You won't be producing them into the putting them in the actual exam, but you'll need them in your workings to work out how prices are going to move when they give you in a scenario. So let's look at our types of goods and how their demand curves are going to look and how their demand curves are going to shift. So normal goods are ones that have a fall in demand as the price increases, or a rise in demand as the price falls. So it's assumed that with the normal goods, it's assumed that individuals always want more of something than less. So there's 2 things that are assumed. One is that you want more of something than less, and the second thing is the more that you have it, the less you value it. So let's take a Mars bar. It's an ordinary good. If you go out and you like Mars bars, let's say you're going to have to assume that you're going to like them. If you were to go to purchase 1 Mars bar, which you really wanted, you might pay £1 for that 1 Mars bar. So you bought this 1 Mars bar and you paid £1 for it. And the supplier goes, well, would you like a multi-pack and of 3 Mars bars? And you go, okay, but I'll pay £2 for the 3 of them. So you can see how already you're starting to reduce the price. You're going to meet the 3 Mars bars, and then the supplier goes, would you like another Mars bar? Tell you what, I got this 8-pack of Mars bars, would you like that? You're not going to be paying, you might pay sort of £3 or £4 for the 8-pack, but you're still not going to be paying £1 a Mars bar. There's no way you're going to be paying £8 for this £8, but this 8-pack of Mars bars. Really. So eventually you get sick of eating Mars bars, and the amount that you're going to prepare to pay is going to be lower. So that's a normal or ordinary good. A gifting good, this is one where actually it's the price that drives the demand. So imagine a woman's handbag that's typically provided as a gift for special occasions by a partner. If the price is low, it's considered cheap and therefore not a worthy present. So women's expensive handbags, luxury watches, really flash cars, although they tend to have a high cost that goes associated with them, but really expensive ones, very, very expensive gold trainers or something worn by celebrities. The actual price itself, grills on your teeth as a rap star. The price itself is the thing that's driving the actual flaunting of your wealth, really, and therefore, actually, if you provided it cheaper, then it wouldn't have the same value. So gifting goods are weird goods. They are referred to in the syllabus. So it's possible you could have a question on them, and they are prices that if you drop the price, the demand falls as well. Their high price generates. Now, does a gifting good really have a sort of upward sloping demand curve? The higher the price, the more people want it. No, it sort of has more of a hook, really. They're going to get to be a point, a sort of a sweet spot where you're getting starting to take the mick in terms of what you're charging for it. So let's say a Rolex watch at sort of 10 grand, and you're starting to say 100 grand for that Rolex watch, unless it's all covered in diamonds or whatever, the demand's dropping. So gifting goods, unusual goods really. So you just have to memorise what they are really. They're sort of the sort of the expensive women handbag of goods. Substitute goods. Substitute goods are ones which can replace a similar good. So they're almost like competing goods with the good. So in, let's say, in chocolate bars, let's imagine we've got flakes and twirls. And they're very similar. They're both made by Cadbury. They both involve Cadbury's chocolate. The flakes are a little bit flakier than the twirl, but pretty much the twirl's a flake surrounded by a bit of chocolate. Sorry for all the people who sort of like saying this is heresy at this point in time. But if one was much more expensive than the other, then you'd obviously flip to the cheaper one. So if the flake was twice the price of the twirl, you'd go, oh, I'll have the pack of twirls, please. So that's one option. And let's make it a little bit more sort of wide-ranging. So let's say, for example, electric cars compared to internal combustion engine cars. So both both substitutes for one another. Both drive, both cars. They both drive you from A to B. And there, if there was a semiconductor shortage, let's say, that drives up the price of electric cars, then people would move from those electric cars and they go back and buy internal combustion engine cars. Alternatively, let's say the price of electricity shoots up, the electric car is now much more expensive, and therefore people move to internal combustion engines. Alternatively, the way around, let's say the price of petrol goes up, and then people move from petrol engine cars to electric cars. And you can see a lot of the movements in demand over the last few years, really, in electric cars has been very much about the price of petrol versus the price of electricity. And we're seeing the price of electricity going up quite heavily now, and a sort of flick back to the internal combustion engine. Complementary goods are ones whose demand is dependent upon each other, either through the price of the other good influence the demand for the good, or just simply the fact that the other good exists, the demand for the other good creating your sort of changing. So we've got an example of our electric car and electricity. The price of electricity goes up, therefore the demand for our electric car goes down. That's one option. Or the alternative thing is that the complementary good actually creates the demand. So cars and rubber tyres, there wouldn't be a demand for tyres if there wasn't the cars in existence. So if the demand for cars goes down because, let's say, the economy shrinks and people can't buy cars, then the demand for tyres goes down. So complementary goods are ones who are complements to each other. The demand for the other good drives the demand for our good. In terms of luxury and inferior goods, the best way of sort of describing this one, so luxury, inferior, and normal goods really, and the best way to describe it is that people's desires can be separated into wants and needs. So wants and needs in there, and some goods are essential, they're the things you need. And only once those needs are satisfied, first, can you then move on to the wants, the sort of luxury goods. Here, so luxury goods are sort of desirable, and so when people, so it's a sort of a want rather than a need, and when people's disposable income increases, and so the needs, the normal goods or the essential goods perform a lower percentage of people's disposable income, then the demand for those luxury goods go up. Back to the women's handbags or luxury holidays or expensive cars. So those would be luxury goods. And you might have a scenario whereby the economy shrinks. What's going to happen to the price of foreign holidays? Well, the demand is going to shrink for the foreign holidays. A shift to the left in demand curve, the price and the amount sold is going to go down. In terms of inferior goods, those ones are value options. So these are sort of your value options, and so they're in high demands when household incomes are under pressure. So if you go into Asda at the moment, and you'd see the sort of the yellow goods sort of value options that are there. They're in higher demand because we're in a cost of living crisis, and people are having to sort of switch to those ones. They're seen as the more value options, rather than, let's say, the value option cheese versus the sort of the branded cheese, and people people switch to these inferior goods when they're struggling. And you're going to sort of tighten their belts and what have you. Alternatively, though, if the economy is doing well and the income expands, people switch from the inferior goods to the more luxury goods. They're sort of mainly switching from inferior to normal goods, but they could switch to luxury goods as well. And so, if we were going back into economics in the good old days when I learnt it, the normal good or the luxury good would be the car, and an inferior good would be a cycle, you know, a bike. And so as an economy got richer, people would switch and they'd stop pedaling their cycles around and they'd go and buy themselves a little car. And then as they got even richer, they'd stop buying budget cars and they'd buy expensive cars. So this sort of movement between inferior to normal to luxury goods. That's the theory. And you might have a question sort of saying that the economy shrinks and therefore what's going to happen to good X that's a luxury good? Price is going to drop down. What's going to happen to good Y, the inferior good? Price is going to increase. So what we've seen is the sort of movement towards second-hand cars and budget cars at the moment in the cost of income crisis, and the prices of those cars increasing, even though things are worse in the economy. Fashion can also change our goods as well. Things could just simply not be sort of fashionable anymore. So 100 years ago, it's customary to wear hats. So the demand for hats was high. There's a large hat making industry. Fashion's changed. People no longer wear hats. And demand curve shifted way far to the left. Opposite would be the case for women's trousers. Let's say very few demand for women's trousers 100 years ago, but now there's much higher demand. Shift to the right in the demand curve. So fashion can also as well affect our goods. Let's have a look at supply, so we can finish the other part of the chart, the little charts that you're going to draw. So here we've got our supply curve in here, and we've got the price. The supply curve sets out the price of all of the goods. So if we're going to produce 5 of them, it's going to cost us £5 per unit. The marginal cost curve, which I'll be using more at level 3 really, is the price of the additional unit. So that 5th one actually costs us £5 to produce in total. Sort of averages out. It's assumed that the supply curves are upward sloping. So it's assumed that they're upward sloping, and the reason for that is that right down here, the person making this thing, they love to make this thing. They're really good at it as well. They're amazing at it, and as a consequence, they don't charge much in terms of labour costs in here. As we go up, we got to chase scarcer resources, scarcer labour, scarcer raw materials, and what have you. In there, bids up the price, increases the cost. That's the assumption of the supply curves. In reality, they sort of more hook down first with economies of scale, and then they hook up. And that's how a supply curve typically sort of looks. It really sort of goes down and then up. So that's our supply curve. And if we increase our costs, if our costs go up, government applies a tax to their product, increases the cost. Shortage in raw materials increases the cost. Shortage in labour increases the cost. Those kind of things. That's a shift upwards in our supply curve. It now costs more to produce the same thing. Improvement in technology, reducing the cost, shift downwards in the supply curve. So that would be it. So we're going to stick them together. We've got our supply and demand curves here. We don't really need to worry too much about our marginal costs and our marginal revenue curves. Although in real life, if we were a monopoly, we would maximise our profit where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. We would charge £7.5 in this one here and restrict supply to 2.5 units, and that's what would make the most profit. But we're going to assume that there's not a monopoly, and we can't restrict the supply, and so at that point we will sell where the supply curve is equal to the demand curve at this point here. That's known as the equilibrium point, where price is, in this instance, £5, and we produce 5 units of it. Now what you're going to do then in the exam is you're going to consider where something's going to happen. And you're going to consider what that does to the supply and demand curve. So you can draw out the supply and demand curve, use this nice 10-10 kind of approach really in here. That's the easiest way to do it in there. And then you're going to see something that's going to happen. So there's a technological improvement that reduces the costs. Shift down the supply curve. What's going to happen to the prices? Well, the price is going to reduce, the amount that's sold is going to reduce. You won't be required to ask to say what the actual amount is going to reduce by. Do that in the economics exam. Or alternatively, there's an increase in cost. Shift up the supply curve. There's an increase in demand. Shift it to the right. There's a reduction in the demand for a complementary good. Shift the demand curve to the left. There's an increase in the cost of a substitute good, which means that's going to increase the price of that substitute good, which is going to reduce the quantity of that substitute good being sold, which is going to increase the demand of our good. Shift the demand curve to the right. So you're going to write out, especially if you see substitute and complementary goods, write out the chart for the substitute and complementary good and see what happens to that. Then work out what that does to our demand curve, and then write that out as well for your demand curve, and then see what the price moves. So that's really what you're going to do a lot of it. Giffen goods, you won't really write a curve out for a Giffen good. You'll just sort of say, well, it's just a good that is driven by the value of its price. So its price makes its value, really, and that's our supply and demand curve. So that's the microeconomics part of it. Into macroeconomics now. Macroeconomics is about the size of the economy, gross domestic product, and governments are trying to sort of make the economy grow, and they use macroeconomic policy to do it. Two elements of it: fiscal policy, which is taxation. If I tax more or I tax less, it affects the amount of the economy. Government spending, and then also as well things that they do in terms of investment in productivity, and they're going to have wealth distribution and things like that, really. So that's what we're going to have in our fiscal policy in here. In a very simplified world, from an AAT perspective, increased spending or reduced taxes is going to increase growth in there. So increased government spending is more activity going on, and that's increasing GDP. Reducing taxes gives more money into the economy, increases GDP through increased growth. That's their view. A very Keynesian world, really, that the AAT is sort of living in. However, consider the monetary policy really here. So in terms of on the monetary side, we've got money supply. So if you put more money into the economy and we increase the money supply, we actually haven't produced anything else, and there's nothing more being produced. So all that happens is that we have more money chasing the same amount of goods, and it increases the price of those goods. So we have inflation, and we also have interest rates as well. So if interest rates go up, let's say the government's borrowing too much, and the market doesn't like it, doesn't think it's going to pay, and so sees a risk premium that goes in there, increases interest rates, then that is going to reduce investment. And then we've got exchange rates as well, and exchange rates are driven by inflation and also as well by interest rates. So this is sort of money's going, supply and demand for money, really. So if exchange rates increase, then we've got more, our pounds are worth more. The price of raw materials reduces, so our oil that we pay for in dollars goes down, price of that. Price of raw materials comes in, price of food coming in goes down, and then but also as well we have to sell our things abroad, and now they're more expensive. And they're more, our cars, and they're more expensive for Americans to buy. So you've got these things going on here. In terms of an AAT land, really, inflation is a reduction in the value of money. So inflation reduces the value of money, and that means that imagine you've got a pound in your pocket. You go forward a year in a time machine. You come out of the time machine. You still got that pound in your pocket. What's it buying you now? It's probably buying you now 90 pence worth of stuff in this current 10% inflation world that we have. So inflation is a reduction in the value of money. Deflation, which is an increase in the value of money. That means that in this year further, you can actually now buy more. Prices have gone down. So we have inflation and deflation. In reality, high inflation is, it means it's too risky, and so that reduces investment. But deflation as well means reducing prices, so that reduces inflation. And so what you really want is a sort of a lowish 1 to 2% inflation. It gets everybody sort of investing, and all feels nice and stable and confident, and has low interest rates as well, and everybody feels happy. And so if we go back to the AAT land, and let's have a look at Liz Truss's mini budget here. Well, she's holding her spending steady. She wasn't going to sort of reduce spending. She was going to have the same amount, but her intention was to reduce taxation, specifically on the rich. So we're going to have a redistribution of wealth from the poor to the rich, really, in there. We might sort of hold some spending cuts on on poor people in terms of, let's say, the pensioners triple lock, going and having benefits linked to earnings rather than inflation. And so that was the plan, and the intention was that it would increase growth, but also it would increase productivity, and people would be motivated to work harder. Okay, but what really happened? Well, firstly, it was in a period of very high inflation as well, so it was more money going into the economy, chasing fewer goods as well, so it's pushing up inflation even further. And the government or the markets didn't consider that government could pay its way. They didn't think that they were bringing in enough money to be able to pay for their government spending. As a consequence, they increased interest rates. So interest rates increased, and interest rates increased especially for businesses as well, not just government, but also for businesses, which reduced investment. And the exchange rate tanked as well because it required an increase in government borrowing, which had to be brought in from abroad. That's more more pounds that have to be sold for dollars or for Chinese currency or for Japanese currency or whatever it is, well, whether it's Saudi Arabia for their oils, whatever it was that was having to come in there. So it was reducing exchange rates, which was also then increasing raw materials costs, which was adding to inflation and creating a wage price spiral as well. So a lot of risk thrown in to that budget, and overall, risk is expensive. So whilst the AAT position is very simplified really in terms of this increased spending, reduced taxes, increases growth, it does sort of focus on, it does consider some monetary policy in here, and it is correct, AAT, in terms of saying that what you really after actually is low risk. Low risk in the economy, as low risk as possible in the economy as you can have, to be able to then build a platform on which investment can be undertaken, really. And that's what drives productivity. And so Liz Truss's position in terms of being quite a bit of a wrecker, really, in terms of she was unashamedly growth, and was going to upset the order, actually just spooked the markets and really was never going to work, because it just was running counter to just sensible corporate finance, really. So that's why it didn't work. So we're now going into, so that gives us our macroeconomic policy, and really what we're going to take from that is inflation, reduction in the value of money, deflation, increase in the value of money, increased government spending or reduced taxes increases GDP, but also increases inflation, and risk in terms of the inflation is going to be something which is not good for the economy, and could reduce growth, reduce investment, and exchange rates. An appreciating exchange rate is one where the exchange rate's increasing. We get more dollars for our pounds. That's going to reduce raw materials costs and imports. It's going to reduce exports because our exports are now more expensive. And a depreciating exchange rate is going to increase the cost of our inputs, our imports, but it's going to increase the amount of our exports because those exports are now cheaper in terms of our supply and demand curves for foreigners. That's what you need to take from monetary policy. Now, it's a strange one, this one, because AAT does like to discuss the principles of good taxation policy. Now, these are the principles of good taxation policy, and now we're getting to sort of it sort of looks at it in a very sort of simplified way, but you can sort of push out to that, and quite political, really, this sort of side. So, the principles of good taxation policy are certain that it should be clear, easy to understand, and easy to calculate. You need to memorize these bits. So this particular here, you do need to memorize these points here. You'll have a question in terms of what are the principles of good taxation. So certain, should be clear, easy to understand, easy to calculate. It should be convenient. It should be easy for taxpayers to comply with the policy. It should be economic. It should be, the cost to actually collect or calculate and collect the taxation should be economic. It should be low compared to the actual tax collected. Now, equitable is one where it's interesting. Taxpayers in similar situations should pay the same amount, and the more wealth a person has, the higher should be their tax burden. So this is, taxes should be progressive, and they should be sort of equitable. You and I in the same situation should be paying the same tax. They should be fair. Income shouldn't be taxed the same. Shouldn't be double taxation, and they should be transparent. Individuals' affairs should be transparent to avoid tax, and so it's difficult to avoid taxation. Right, now you can agree in terms of convenient, and you can agree in terms of economic. Those two just make sense. It's pointless having a tax that costs more to collect than you can actually charge. Than it costs to actually administer the tax. But then we get out into these other ones really here. So to make these more sensible, I'll sort of make them more bearable. I'll sort of take you through some various taxation features of the current UK taxation system, and you can consider whether they fit within these taxation principles or not. So let's say we take rules on who are. Let's do certain first of all. Rules on who or who isn't an employee. So these are known as IR35 rules. They're introduced with the intention of bringing more self-employed people who are not really self-employed into employed status and increasing the taxes that they pay. They pay national insurance tax and they pay higher income tax. They're subsequently scrapped in the money budget, although probably being brought back, who knows? Because this video has been done at the point where Liz Truss has just resigned. The book was written at the point where the mini budget has just come out and just saying this is going to go badly wrong. The video was done at the point where Liz Truss has, resigned. I mean, the book said it was going to go badly wrong. So let's have a look at this situation here. Let's say there are considerable arguments over who and who isn't an employee. So, for example, let's say we take Gary Lineker. He's being pursued at the moment for £5 million of unpaid tax that he was paid as self-employed through his own media company for appearances on BBC and BT Sports, rather than being paid as a BBC employee. But the BBC are telling him to turn up to Match of the Day at a particular time and send along Gary Lineker. Don't send along anybody else that Gary Lineker can choose to put in his place. As a consequence, really, the consideration is that he's an employee and should be therefore paying that tax. So there's two things really. On the one hand, certain, I was in a situation that's not his understanding of the taxation policy, but also certain in terms of, well, who's an employee, who isn't an employee, and can we actually get IR35 to work, even though it's getting scrapped in one budget versus another budget? Who knows really on that one, really. So is it certain? Not really, because what we have is very different taxes for very different circumstances, rather than what's known as a flat tax across everybody. Right, let's have a look at our sort of convenient, economic, and equitable. Well, first of all, should individuals, should this sort of BBC presenter be able to set themselves up as self-employed through a media company and have different amounts being paid to everybody else? Or should alternatively, let's say Wayne Rooney puts his image rights through a company, collects all of his image rights through his own company there though, and then doesn't pay himself an income, but collapses it later on at some point when there's a benefit to pay capital gains rather than that at a much lower rate than income that is paid, income tax that's paid by employees. Is that equitable? Same circumstances, same income being earned, but different amounts being paid. Should individuals have non-domiciled status? There's an argument about that at the moment. Should people who live in this country, but earn overseas, pay tax in this country or not? And should the Chancellor gain as well as being married to one? As the current Prime Minister was. So we've got this sort of situation really here, whereby we've got certainly these ones sort of breaking down. In terms of equitable, now we talk about in terms of we've got people in the same situation here. Well, actually, or progressive and regressive taxation, the highest marginal income tax rate within the UK is currently 60%. So it's not a 45% as the highest taxation rate; it's 60%, and that's for tax on people who earn between £100,000 and £125,000 worth of income, and they pay 60% of their income. Between £100,000 and £125,000. If somebody earns £1 million, they're paying 45% on everything after the £125,000. So they pay overall a lower percentage of their tax on their income than this other person's earning amount. So there is this regressive taxation sort of sitting in there because of the way in which personal allowances are calculated. Is that equitable? Absolutely not. It is a weird one that's even been allowed to sort of stay. But what we've got really in equitable, and then we've got in fair, because fair we have pensioners who are subject to double taxation. We didn't used to have that, so I was sort of saying that these two especially were features of taxation back pre-1997. So it isn't just one party in terms of the Conservatives, generally doing this. A lot of this stuff broke down under the sort of the New Labour, Gordon Brown Chancellor era, really, where previously we had pensioners and they would pay into their pension schemes, and the companies would be subject to corporation tax, and when they paid dividends, those dividends had a little slip that attached to them, and that allowed the pension schemes to reclaim the taxation that was paid on the corporation tax and dividends. Now, what happened then was that that was scrapped. And what that means is that pensioners are getting taxed twice. They get taxed in the corporation tax on the earnings that they earn from their investment, and they get taxed then on that amount in their income tax. So they're getting double taxation. And this was considered a terrible thing at the time, and you'd always sort of see as one of the criticisms levelled at Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, that they sort of they robbed pension pots. A fair point, really. That they double taxed there, and you could have an argument really in terms of equitable. In here, on the one hand, the 60% tax rate now, which was introduced in the austerity sort of times, really, that 60% tax rate between 100,000 and 125,000. You could also say access to free childcare being dependent upon a single person in the household. So if one person in the household earns over £100,000, then they don't get it. If two, let's say they have a partner who's disabled, let's say, and they can't work, so they're the sole breadwinner, but they only earn £100,000. They don't get access to free childcare. If that household has two people on £80,000, so they got £60,000 more worth of household income, they do get access to free childcare. So you've got these kind of inequities going through. Let's look at the counters for those ones. One could say, well, you've got to take the rough with the smooth on this sort of example of the two people versus one people on access to free childcare. Doesn't really stack up, that one, but is there on the pensioners one? I think Gordon Brown would argue that pensioners get 25% of their pension pot tax-free, so they were actually getting not taxed on that at all, and so this was just a levelling up of that situation. So you could argue that was fair, in that it wasn't double taxation, even though for 100 years it had been considered double taxation in there, and with the personal rates of tax and the reduction of the personal allowance and the 60% tax rate, just well, those ends of the breaks really. Very much then, in terms of these principles of good taxation policy, depending upon your point of view, really. I don't think you'll have to answer questions remotely, a written question on these. That would be very unlikely, because you usually get into very detailed points of taxation policy. But you might have a multiple choice question which is about which ones these are, and so I've tried to make them memorable for you, really, in terms of being able to sort of you answer them and get them right. But those are what they meant. Now in addition to memorising those and working out which ones are which in terms of principles of taxation policy, you're going to have to define taxes. So in terms of whether revenue or capital. So revenue is on income, capital is on wealth. Whether they're direct, levied immediately on the individual, or indirect via a company, let's say an intermediate party. So we'll see VAT is the indirect one in here, and whether they're progressive or regressive taxation. So progressive is the more money you've got, the more you pay. Regressive is the less money you've got, the less percentage of your total income, or the more percentage of your total income you pay. So let's go through them. Income tax, right? So it's income tax in there. So it's on income. It's on revenue. So it's revenue one. It's direct because it's paid by the individual in there, direct to HMRC, and similarly corporation tax. Corporation tax will be in here as well. Partnerships, tax paid by partnerships, those kind of things, they would all be sitting in this direct sort of revenue lines in here. Are they progressive? Yes, they are. Right, I gave an example where they weren't progressive, but that was a very much of an extreme example, really. And generally they're progressive. People, the more you pay, and if you would look at the top 10% payers of income tax pay 60% of total income tax, so you'd have to say that was a progressive system. I think the top 1% pay 22.7%, something like that, really, of all income tax paid. Capital gains, so that's a gain on wealth when it's realised. So that's a capital tax, capital gains. Direct, so direct on the individual. Progressive or regressive? Well, questionable, this one, really. Theoretically progressive, but structures can be put in place that actually make them regressive. I gave the sort of the image rights, the celebrity putting their income through a company and then collapsing the company, gaining capital, paying capital gains rather than income tax. Questionable, really, because there's quite a lot of capital gains allowances each year that you can sort of be earning with tax-free. So you actually can flip things into a company, just pay 15% corporation tax, then collapse the company, gain the capital gain, repurchase shares, whatever, gain a capital gain, not pay any tax at all, except the 15% corporation tax rather than 40% or 45% income tax. Too complicated for VAT level 2, but it is questionable. VAT is on revenue, so it's revenue one. It's a sales tax, and that is indirect. So it's the only one in the list that's indirect. Collected by the company, so levied on the goods, collected by the company, paid over to HMRC, but really the buyer pays. It's a regressive tax. So let's say I earn twice as much as you earn in there, and we both go out and we both buy a packet of fags. I don't smoke, but we are going to, and we both pay the same VAT on that amount. Really, you're earning half the amount that I'm earning. As a proportion of your income, you've paid more tax than I have. Now, actually, as it tends to happen is that a lot of the items have very high sales taxes on, cigarettes, alcohol, tend to have high usages with people on low incomes. Lottery taxes, betting taxes, those kind of things. Very high usage by people on low incomes, and very sort of regressive taxation, which is the argument against those ones. The flip side would be that you tend to see high taxes on vices. Smoking, drinking, betting, and car use. Things that generate carbon. So although they are regressive, and so that would be considered bad, the items themselves are considered bad, and therefore that gives the excuse for the regressive taxation policy. Luxury car tax. So we could say that luxury car tax and road duty here, we could say that's a revenue levied on the individual on the car, direct. So it's direct by the individual, and you could say it's progressive in that the luxury car tax is on cars over £40,000, and so therefore you're going to have a more expensive car. To be able to do that. Flip side on this one is you could say that electric cars, and they are more expensive, and a Tesla or Porsche Taycan is sort of owned by somebody who's got a lot more money, and they're avoiding the luxury car tax entirely. So you could say it's regressive in those situations. But you'd say there's other reasons for that. And this is where taxation policy is trying to push particular behaviours. Inheritance tax is on wealth capital, and it's direct. It's on the dead person, although the living person who gets the stuff is usually the person who's really paying it, but it's direct. Okay, so that's our taxation policy. So we've got principles of taxation, and then you've got this sort of categorize the taxation idea, and then hopefully I've gone through and explained what progressive and regressive is, and what's direct and indirect, and what revenue and capital is. Well, right, so we've got globalization. I'm going to do risk after that. So globalization, really the advantages of being part of a global world and the disadvantages of being part of a global world. So advantages, we got cheaper imports and the ability to export, and the disadvantages, risk, competition, and also there's a carbon footprint for transporting goods. In terms of ability to specialise, so we could specialise and reduce our costs, drive down the supply curve. So people in Germany, they specialise in producing high-end motor vehicles in Bremen or wherever, in Audi, and that's their plan. They produce these high-end, expensive cars. The risk of it, though, is what happens when there's a war in Ukraine and they specialise in the world's wheat production. Drives, and there's a lot of UK food security issues going on. We've also got then the access to a bigger pool of labour. We can bring people in. We could do before Brexit, and this global. On the one hand, we can have bigger pool of labour, and also as well we can have global competition, forcing labour to be more productive. The disadvantage, losses of jobs to overseas, and also as well perhaps exploitation and damaging the environment. Those are particular things that can happen as well. And I suppose this was a big argument in Brexit, where there's an argument in terms of saying, people from Eastern Europe taking people's jobs over here. When they've gone, we'll all be able to have more. People can do all these jobs, and as it doesn't really work out like that, has it? It's been a bit of a disaster, really, as we lost all our HGV drivers and everything else in there. And we can see now that the arguments for Brexit have switched very much from an economic argument that the NHS is going to get lots and lots more money, and it's not really worked at all. I think the value or the size of the UK economy in 2016 before Brexit was 90% of Germany, and now in 2022 after Brexit it's 70% of the size of Germany. So clearly Brexit's not worked from an economic point of view, and what we can see now is the shift of the Brexit argument about sovereignty. It was never about economics at all. We didn't really care about having money. We really just wanted to have the ability to make our own laws on the size of sausages or whatever nonsense it was, or a load of fish. Stupid argument, really, I'm afraid. And Brexit just was not an economic argument. There's no economic argument for Brexit at all, really. Greater access to goods and services, in terms of that ability there, but obviously greater competition for those goods, especially when something happens in a COVID pandemic. Let's say a COVID pandemic we've got worldwide. Everybody's chasing PPE supplies across the world. We've got possibility for global supplies. We can have global supply reducing fluctuations in price. So let's say we now have blueberries in October, and previously they would be from Scotland, and now they're got from South America. and we can, if there's a bad harvest in Scotland, Scottish blueberries, and then we can get them from South America. Actually, what happens is that then we now get them from South America, and it's outcompeted the Scottish blueberry world. So in terms of competition, it's now not economic to harvest Scottish blueberries. We can have risk to exchange rates though, because exchange rates can change. So the mini budget crashed the pound, and as a consequence, price of oil is went through the roof for us. Fortunately, it's sort of not we got back a little bit more from that. But those fluctuations from exchange rates can change our prices and be driving all of our policies, things that we might not have much control over. And there might be other things, in terms of we might be able to exchange ideas to get our way out of, climate change catastrophe, and global warming, really. But on the flip side, what we do see as well within globalization is politicians needing to win, really, against other politicians, and maybe bid off, sort of agreements on climate change. Let's say Donald Trump just decided to scrap them. So we can see here that in globalization we've got advantages and disadvantages all the way through. And this is a very good written question, really, and it's a good example of a written question. You sort of see the sort of state, explain, extend version of written questions with upsides and downsides to really sort of build this box of answers. You've pretty much on globalization got an advantage, a disadvantage for every advantage. And so you need to sort of focus your way through that. So that's the advantages and disadvantages of globalization. You need to be able to know that. You'll have a question that's something along the lines of globalization affecting every part of the business, which is what it does. It affects every part of the business, and how it's going to affect every part of the business. So just memorize that table really. Last bit then, risk. And so in terms of risk then, risk basically is, we have reward to pay for risk. That's the whole point of business and what have you, is that we take risk, and provided that the risk is sufficiently low compared to the amount of investment that we make, the reward that we're going to get, then it's worth taking. If the risk is too high for the reward that we're likely to get, it's not worth taking. That's it, really. That's the whole of business. So that's why did Liz Truss's mini budget fail? Well, it increased risk. And so by increasing risk, no amount of productivity gain, whatever was going to be said, was ever going to outdo the increase in the risk that was being driven into the economy. And that was why it was always going to fail, and it was never going to work. And markets always knew that they would break that particular budget, because it could never be possible. And when you get into that situation, the market knows what's going to happen, and knows that there's going to be backtracking, or knows what. Then they factor those into price, and they actually go and break a government. It's the same as Black Wednesday, when you have this sort of situation whereby there's always going to be an outcome that can't be sort of overcome, and the markets then sort of pile in, and you can't make it. You're sort of like trying to be Canute standing before the tides. So risk versus reward, really, and risk is important, and the lower the risk, the better for an economy. So how do we categorize our risk, and how do we get going in terms of knowing our risks anyway? We'll have this thing called pestle analysis, which is political, economic, social, technological, legal and environmental. So memorize those ones there. And in real life, you tend to use that to just sort of as a reminder. Have I focused on all of the risks that we're going to have? And so you use this to build up the risks. In the AAT exam, you're going to be given risks and categorize them as political, economic. You put them in there. Which one's a political one? Which one's a technical one? At level 3, you're probably going to have to write something out. Like, so you begin given an example of a company, and you're going to say, right, well, give us 3, or give us an economic risk, give us a social risk, and give us an environmental risk. Whatever. So political is about governments and how stable they are. So we've had a lot of instability in the last few weeks, really. I think we've gone through three governors, and I don't know how many chancellors, 5 I think. So it's been very unstable, the UK, and that's an interesting point. The UK has always been a very stable economy. That's where our wealth's been based upon. It's been an incredibly stable and incredibly law-abiding. We don't have people going out. The level of protesting is very low. The laws apply to everybody. Used to. That's the basis of our country. And why has this sort of instability causing a lot of problems? Really, is because we don't really like to have instability in this country. It increases the risk and therefore reduces the value of our economy. That's why interest rates are going up for mortgages. Economic, fiscal and monetary policy that the government might underplay, affecting inflation, demand, amounts of taxes we have to pay, and whatever. Social, changes in fashion. So things change. So these hats, changes in fashion. People no longer wear hats. Our business, hat making business goes out of business. Technological. So this is where we can sort of change our technology. If we're making a technological gain, we're improving our competitiveness and we're winning. If somebody else makes the technological gain, and we're now going to lose. Let's say quite often you're going to see a technological question, something along the lines of a company that doesn't have a website, that kind of thing. That would be a technological risk. We don't have a website. Everybody else has a website. We need to get a website. Legal could be where the government sort of comes along and changes the law. So let's say it introduces a sugar tax to try and reduce obesity because the average or the life expectancy of people is dropping due to obesity. Let's introduce a sugar tax that will do that. And where say we sell fizzy drinks, that sugar tax is going to bite into our profits. Let's lobby to not have the sugar tax. Nanny state. Yeah, there we go. It's a slogan there. We decided to spend some money on lobbying for that it's all a nanny state. Let's keep making people obese. And then environmental, we've got climate change and risk of natural disasters. So we're going to sort of fit all of those ones in there. On the environmental side as well, we could also as well have how our companies pursued if we considered if we start chopping down the Amazon rainforest to get some wood. So all of that could also as well sit within that social one, couldn't it as well? So you'll be dropping those ones in there, and that'll be your pest analysis. That was a long video. This is a very large section, really, the business environment question. A lot of questions, as you could see there, running across for the 10 marks that sit within it. 10 might be a few more. You have got a lot really that you got to get through. I don't think you'll be able to get through it in terms of just trying to memorize the whole thing. It's one of those things where I think you're going to have to just try and understand it and sort of listen to this a bit more really. I don't even think it's 14 marks for the business and economics. So 14 marks in this thing. So you have to know it, because you can't not do 14 marks within the thing. But there was a lot to get through there. This is a 50-minute video, isn't it? Good luck with that. And I'll see you in the next one. In the next one, we're going to do corporate social responsibility as well. It's a little bit of a shorter chapter in there. That was a bit of a long one. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.